Good afternoon. My name is Todd Lyons, and I am the Vice President of the Naval Postgraduate School Alumni Association and Foundation. It's an honor to have an incredible panel with us to have a conversation about reframing great power competition in light of some of the challenges that we faced over the last year with COVID, with incredible disinformation, and also just the change in administration as we move forward. We also have some incredible guests with us that will help shape the conversation as we go through this discussion this afternoon. A couple of ground rules for the discussion today. We encourage you to put your questions in chat as we go along. We will be taking questions from that and moderate it for the discussion with our panelists. Additionally, we encourage you to keep your microphones on mute so that we can ensure that our panelists have an opportunity to be heard by everyone and eliminate as many distractions as we possibly can. This has been a great opportunity for us to bring this group together. Our president and CEO of the Naval Postgraduate School Foundation, Rich Patterson, is glad to have everyone here. He's on travel right now. Otherwise, he would be here to make the introductions as well. And with that, I really want to get into the meat of this discussion today, which is how do we reframe great power competition in light of the changes over the last two years? And with that, we'll start with our first guest and a very good friend of mine, Colonel retired from the Marine Corps, Bill Vivian. Bill retired from the Marine Corps in 2018 after 31 years on active duty. Bill was an infantry officer who commanded at each level from a platoon of 40 to a regiment of over 4,000 Marines. Along the way, he earned master's degrees in operational planning, military studies, and resource strategy. Bill currently supports concept writing for the Marine Corps Warfighting Laboratory. Bill, welcome to our conversation.
Hey, thanks, Todd, and it's great to see you again. And thanks also to Rich, even though he couldn't be here. So you mentioned that great power competition, the discussion is about 2 years old. I would like to expand the envelope on that quite a bit. First of all, you know, the Alumni Association Foundation has a great mission. But the very existence of the Naval Postgraduate School is a competitive act on behalf of our nation. Certainly, you know, for the naval services, but the broader joint force, if we choose to think of it that way. And so recently, the Marine Corps published Marine Corps doctrinal publication 1-4 titled Competing, which really establishes the philosophical foundation for competition with great powers and just others on the international stage. As you know well, the touchstone for the Marine Corps warfighting philosophy is Marine Corps Doctrinal Publication 1, Warfighting. And in that publication, it talks about, here's a quote I'll read: "Total war and perfect peace rarely exist in practice. Instead, they are extremes by which exist the relations among political groups. This range includes routine economic competition, more or less permanent political or ideological tension, and occasional crises among groups." And that's it. And that was, as you know, was published originally by General Gray in 1989 and then republished in 1997. So this new publication is to expand that, to give Marines and others some more traction when they consider what they should be doing to contribute to the nation's competitions. Because the joint force writ large, when we talk about competition below the threshold of violence, is a supporting act that is integrated with the other elements of national power. But when we were writing for a Marine audience, we wanted them to know that from recruitment to retirement, they are competing on behalf of the nation, whether they acknowledge it or not. And we wanted to bring it into the forefront of their mind. You know, war and armed conflict itself reside on the competition continuum. And so they are a subset of competition. It's not the other way around. So the competition continuum actually is much broader than violent acts. It includes them very definitely. And even Clausewitz said, in war, the result is never final. And part of what that means is that whenever a conflict emerges, it sets the conditions for the type of competition that's going to take place after violence recedes. In the publication, we include a lot of vignettes. We call them the gray boxes, and they illustrate many of the points that we make. And going back to how war sets the conditions for the competition that follows, just look at World War II, right? So from the Marine perspective in particular, the struggle with Japan, once that was finished, the violence receded. That set the stage for the competition that would continue afterward, right? And that continued, most prominently in the 70s and 80s as their automobile manufacturers really rose up. And that was a very challenging time period for the US economically, right? But that was still in the nature of competition when we talk about things in international relations. It was a very interesting process to go through helping draft this publication because it originally had 4 chapters to describe what competition is to a Marine audience, some of the theory of it, and then how the conduct of competition could unfold. It wasn't prescriptive. Again, it was philosophical because it was a companion to warfighting, right? The yin and yang of what Marines do. But as it circulated around, the Commandant received feedback that said, hey, how is this going to look from a potential competitor's standpoint? And so we included a 5th chapter that unpacked that a little bit. We could go into great detail on that, but what I would like to highlight right now is the contrast between the Western binary notion of international relations with you're either at peace or at war. And we believe that's a fallacy. Mao said war is politics with bloodshed, and politics is war without bloodshed. And so that kind of encapsulates the mindset of some of our adversaries out there. And we potentially put ourselves at a pretty big disadvantage if we think of things and, hey, I'm at peace and I'm not competing. Not true. 2 other things I'd like to highlight. The first one is that acquisitions itself is a very competitive act, and it's co-evolutionary with adaptive adversaries. And so what did we mean when we wrote that? Well, first of all, if you look at our preferred power projection concept, we know that adversaries across the globe have observed that for decades now, and they've adapted themselves in order to make that more difficult for us. So that's an element of competition. And then you can look at the F-35 program, love it or hate it. Since the program office stood up in 1996, in some ways, that was a catastrophic success as a competitive act because it forced our potential adversaries to react to it. Now, not going to go into the details on that, but when you view that as a competitive act and to see how the operating environment reacted, it encourages you to think of what other types of things can we do. The final point I'll make is I want to emphasize asymmetry of interests, which we have a wonderful little vignette in the publication that talks about the Cod Wars, which was between the United Kingdom and Iceland after World War II. They actually competed with elements of violence, not shooting, but other types of violence 4 times. And because it was so much more important to Iceland, they ended up getting their way and they established their fishing rights and their sovereign rights over their exclusive economic zone. I'll leave it there for now, and I look forward to the dialogue. Thanks, Todd.
Outstanding. Thank you so much, Bill. Glad to have you with us on the panel. I want to turn to our next guest. We are privileged to have Corey Shockey join us. Corey Shockey leads the Foreign Policy and Defense team at the American Enterprise Institute. She is the author of Safe Passage, The Transition from British to American Hegemony, and a contributing writer at The Atlantic, War on the Rocks, and Bloomberg. Corey, welcome to our conversation.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate you guys wanting to engage in this conversation. So a couple of thoughts. First, the United States has always been engaged in great power competition. If you think about the Monroe Doctrine in 1823, where we declare that the Americas are no longer territory for colonial acquisition, and we have almost no ability to enforce that for 70 years. But we were making a statement about who we were and what we stood for in order to try and prevent Austria-Hungary, Germany, Britain, and France, and Russia from streaming into the Americas as Spain's empire collapsed. Abraham Lincoln does some very delicate footwork in 1863, sending a dispensable American ambassador through London to declare that if Britain intervened in the American Civil War by not honoring the blockade, the United States might assist Scotland and Ireland towards their independence. The post-World War II examples, all easily known to you. We determined that Germany is one of the reconcilables. So we not only give Marshall Plan aid, we rebuild the German military, because by that time, the power we're worried about is the Soviet Union. So I don't think great power competition was a new frame of reference for the United States when the Trump administration posed it. But they posted for a couple of important reasons. The first is that they really wanted to send the shock through the international system that the way we had been dealing with a rising China was insufficient, that we understood that we were going to be more aggressive in our response to managing a rising China. And the second reason is because if you focus narrowly and said, our objective is to contain China, you could not get the regional allies in Asia you needed in order to make that strategy effective. So they pretend that Russia's a great power too. They pretend that Russia and China pose similar kinds of challenges. And the strategy they take on paper, I'm not wild about, but it's not half bad. Jim Mattis and I have been having a running argument for the last 4 years about whether that strategy was sufficient. I think the strategy over-militarized the problem in ways that actually advantage China rather than the United States, because they have the relatively easy coastal waters, near waters, attack Taiwan. And we have the get across the Pacific, hold all these bickering allies together, and don't lose fast kind of challenge, which is just objectively much more difficult. Jim's defense is that the strategy was fine and wasn't over-militarized. It's just that the Pentagon's so much better at its job than everybody else that it looks over-militarized. And even if he's right, I'm still right. Right? We did over-militarize the strategy by letting everything else fall so far behind in the execution. That is a strategy failure. So I think the focus on competing with China is different than the focus on competing with Russia. Russia got thrown in just because they didn't want to single out China. It wasn't politically salient to do so. The China challenge continues to be, as Secretary Austin and Dr. Hicks emphasized in their congressional testimony, that's the pacing challenge. So that's the strategy challenge. And we have, like, I would bet 5-to-1 odds by 2035, groups like this are going to be asking the question, why was the United States obsessed with China in 2020? Couple of reasons I think that's going to be true. First is the demographic collapse of China. It's not only the one-child policy, it's all sorts of other stuff, right? As countries grow more prosperous, people tend to have less children. It's a function of selective gender abortions, taking baby girls out of the pool so you don't get family formation. By 2050, China's going to be not only a depopulated country, it's going to be a country that can't support its elderly population. The second reason to be concerned about China, I encourage all of you to read the work of Michael Beckley, who's a professor at Tufts. And he makes a very compelling case by using the small bore economic data about China to suggest that the economic growth China even now is experiencing is much more costly than producing increased productivity and GDP growth in free societies. And that not only will the Chinese economy stall, the Chinese economy is already stalled. And because they have the ability to lie about their figures, that we're just not able to put the mosaic together quite yet. Michael comes to the conclusion, and I do as well, that doesn't mean we don't need to be concerned about China. It just means we don't have a long-term China challenge, but the near-term China challenge may actually be much more dangerous because they see a closing window of opportunity. And I think that best explains the increased domestic repression and international aggressiveness of China. To the what do we do about it? Again, I think military preparedness is a huge part of it. The defense of Taiwan has become the contemporary equivalent of the defense of Berlin during the Cold War, something that is militarily impossible to do and politically essential. Fortunately for this country and its friends, diabolical creativity is our long suit. That's the advantage free societies have. And it's especially an advantage the United States government has, because with our Wild West 4,000 political appointees into every new administration, everybody having to read what's in the op-ed pages, and a huge cottage industry of think tanks like mine that are administrations in waiting and therefore have every incentive in the world to be publishing in War on the Rocks so that everybody important reads us. And the government has to respond to our ideas. I think we are currently underestimating the advantages to free societies in what has become an ideological competition. This will be my last point, that the Chinese government isn't just saying, we're growing like gangbusters, you have to deal with us. They are saying, oh God, look at the recklessness of the Iraq War, look at the 2008 financial crisis, look at how terribly free societies are handling the pandemic. This shows that, that authoritarian repressiveness is the wave of the future. And we need to puncture that balloon. And the best way to do it is by leaning into the advantages of free societies and using those advantages as our major weaponry. And I'll stop there.
That is fantastic, Corey, and I really appreciate you bringing that perspective. As we go through the conversation, one of the things that I really took away from what you said is not only that we've over-militarized the problem, but that the shadow of the future is actually on our side. So really fantastic. Thank you so much. I now want to introduce our next panelist. We are lucky enough to have Ryan Evans. Ryan Evans is the founder and CEO of War on the Rocks. He's publisher of the Texas National Security Review. He worked at various think tanks in Washington and London, as well as deploying to Afghanistan as part of a human terrain team assigned to the British-led Task Force Helmand. He enjoys good writing, talking with interesting people, and single malt scotch. there's a good place for you out here in Monterey, Ryan. We're glad to have you. Ryan, welcome to our conversation.
Thanks so much. And this is tea, not scotch, although I wish it was scotch. So what I feared most happened, and that's Corey said all the smart things. And so I'm going to try to fill in the very few gaps that she left. It's always a difficult proposition following Corey. I want to agree with her on one important point. I mean, I agree with almost everything she said, but especially this militarizing the strategy. And like everything I say, it's already been said by some very smart people, many of them writing in my publication. But great power competition is not great power war. And I do think we've overly militarized that strategy, and not in a way that increases deterrence, actually hopes to increase our ability to prevail in a contingency that I don't think is actually likely to happen, a short, sharp war. And if it is, I think we're in trouble, because it sort of depends when it happens. I'm less concerned about the near term, more concerned about the mid and long term. But I don't think we have the political will and industrial base to sustain military primacy in Asia. And so this is really going to be a play on our alliances, particularly getting countries like India, Japan, and most difficult, South Korea, reading from the same sheet of music. But the more likely great power war that we will face is actually probably going to be a very prolonged one, in my view. And my ideas on this are very much informed by the work of Cathal Nolan, who wrote a book that many of you probably read a couple years ago called The Allure of Battle. And his basic argument is that wars between great power tend to be prolonged. They are not won by the decisive battle. They are won by the country that politically, financially, logistically is able to stay in the fight longer. And I really worry about our ability to do that, especially looking at the fragility on all levels that COVID has exposed in our society and Western societies over the last year or so. What kind of wars, though, is great power competition more likely to spawn? I think we tell ourselves this myth every 30 years. It goes in a cycle. It's like there is an insurgency that we should get involved in, that we should counter, and we can. And we're, of course, lying to ourselves. And then we fail to do that. And then we're like, we're not going to do this again for a while. So, but that's also a lie. So looking at 2035, what Corey said, I think not only are we going to look back at how did we misread China, but I think we're going to talk about how did we get ourselves into another Vietnam or Afghanistan type situation again, when we know that this is something that we are very, very bad at the strategic level, especially, despite the successes that are often gained temporarily at the operational level. And the final point that I'll make, and this is very quick, is I think all this rests on our ability to get our own house in order. I think we talk about capabilities and capacity and strategy in this sometimes very abstract way, as if it's separated from our domestic politics, but it's really not. And I don't think sustaining American power and primacy is possible without getting our own house in order, renewing our own social and economic compact, and healing some of the political divisions. And I'm not optimistic about our ability to do so. So those are the brief points that I want to make, and I look forward to the Q&A.
Outstanding, Ryan. And I do want to highlight, I think having you here, War on the Rocks is part of that competitive space in which we're operating. And so you play a key role both as a participant in the competition as well as a venue. So thank you so much.
Thanks for reading.
I now turn to our last panelist. We're lucky enough to have Dr. Leo Blanken. He is an associate professor in the Defense Analysis Department at the Naval Postgraduate School. Dr. Blanken is the co-founder for the Applied Design for Innovation at Naval Postgraduate School and the author of Rational Empires, Institutional Incentives and Imperial Expansion. He is the co-editor of Assessing War, The Challenge of Measuring Success and Failure. His most recent article is Making Friends in Maker Spaces, From Grassroots Innovation to Great Power Competition. Welcome, Leo Blanken.
Hey, Todd, thank you so much. And thanks to the foundation for putting on this event. So batting cleanup, also a lot of the points that I wanted to talk about have been raised. So I'll be brief in my comments. I want to hit 5 points very briefly. The first two are what I take to be sort of the defining characteristics of the emerging great power competition space. And then the final 3 points are, I think, issues that the United States and its leadership should think about in confronting this security environment. So the first point was raised by Corey, that great power competition is not something new. And I just want to double tap that point. China is not a problem to be solved in the way that the ISIS caliphate was a problem to be solved. The existence of a nation like China as a rising peer competitor is really a return to the normal functioning of the anarchic international system, a feature which a lot of Americans seem to have forgotten about since 1990. The second feature of the system that I want to put out there is rapidly changing technology. And by that, I don't just mean technology that will allow us to continually update and modernize legacy World War II era concepts and platforms like manned aircraft and capital ships and armored vehicles, but technology that has the potential to fundamentally change the nature of military power in the next few decades. So I'm going to put those out as two defining aspects, in my opinion, of the emerging international system. And then I want to talk about three things that I think US leadership should think about. And these will range from the most like tactical and mechanical up to the most political and strategic. So the first one is what I call out with the old. So right now in the DoD, there's a very robust conversation going on in regards to emerging technology and innovation. Unfortunately, right now, everyone seems to be focused on innovative ways of acquiring new technology. What I think we need to spend just as much time on is thinking hard about innovative ways of abandoning obsolete technology and capabilities. To make space for the new, you need to free up human capital, physical capital, and cut the apron strings from inertial systems. We need to do a better job understanding culture, incentives, SOPs, really the fundamental ontologies that anchor these legacy systems and capabilities into our national security apparatus. So that's point one. Point two is this widening the aperture when thinking about national security investments for great power competition. Since technology is rapidly changing, making huge investments in new systems is extremely risky. And making huge investments to modernize old systems is probably also a mistake. To hedge that risk, we need to have a wider view of what constitutes valuable national security investments in the great power competition context. We need to remember that the Federal Highway Act of 1956 was a national security investment. The National Science Foundation is a national security investment. Land grant universities and the 1944 GI Bill were national security investments. So in sum, right now, I think significant investments in physical infrastructure, research and development, and most importantly, American human capital, both folks in and out of uniform, is probably a wise choice in this era. And I know Bill Vivian mentioned NPS as a national security investment, and I think that's absolutely true. The third point I want to make very briefly, and this gets to some comments that Ryan made, is what do we want to be? So we need some conceptual fixed point that would allow us as a nation to begin to structure a viable grand strategy for the emerging security environment. And that fixed point should be the answer to the fundamental question, what does the United States want to be in the world? Right now, to Ryan's point, I don't think there's consensus around an answer to that question. And finding that answer is going to be a difficult process for our country in the next few years. But unless we understand what we aspire to be on the international stage, all of our plans and strategies and force structure investments are going to be fundamentally unmoored from national purpose. So I'm going to wrap up there and hand it back to you, Todd. Looking forward to the conversation.
Outstanding. Thank you so much. And I'm going to bring our other guests into the conversation, and then we'll get to some of these questions. Let me bring this in, Corey. And so we already have a number of questions that are coming in, and I want to kind of frame this. One of, I guess, the themes that has been coming up in chat a bit is, what are the advantages of the free society and, great power competition, but also as we think about the utility of force in great power competition across that spectrum. And this gets to your point, Corey, about the over-militarization that people were talking about in our great power competition. So how do we evaluate the utility of force and integrate, because we got many military members on here and they say, okay, if great, we've over-militarized it. So what do we do? What is the military, what ought they do in order to kind of deal with that problem? And Corey, I'll start with you.
Okay, so it's not really the military's problem to solve, right? This is the president and the Secretary of Defense's problem to solve, which is how do we keep the elements of our strategy in alignment instead of letting the ability of any department to drive the pace at which they execute their piece of it. Bismarck famously said that politics isn't science, it's art. And we too often treat it like science, which is we have the ability to go 136 miles an hour, therefore we will go 136 miles an hour. I want to take a swing at two other things that were said though. First, the interesting point that about what are the advantages of free societies. So they're the inverse of the vulnerabilities of free societies, right? Like our governments always have to deal with government leaks, whistleblowers, information they don't want in the public. When I was on the NSC doing defense policy, I kept for 2 months score on how long it took between when we had a highly classified meeting and when I read about it in the newspaper, and it was never longer than 2 days, right? So, instead of trying to have strategic communications, which we as a society are incapable of, the big raucous mess of public debates in free societies are something that, first of all, incredibly complicate the bandwidth challenge of authoritarian governments because they're not used to having to deal with it. And second of all, it forces them to have to play to the standard that we are achieving. So my favorite example of this, I'm sorry, Ryan, you've heard this from me 4,700 times, is that when the US Embassy in Beijing put an air quality meter on the roof and started tweeting out the air quality index in Beijing. That did more to get the Chinese to sign the Paris Climate Accords and make the bilateral deal with President Obama than anything American foreign policy was doing, because we provided the Chinese people with information they wanted that their government was denying them, and that drove up the cost to their government of continuing to deny them. The rule of law, financial transparency. Chinese companies shouldn't get to list on Wall Street unless they actually meet the accountancy and disclosure rules. Those aren't hard things to figure out. We're just not doing them.
Boy, Corey, that's fantastic. And one of the things that you highlight is that the documents that we put out are in fact themselves a stone in the game, because we're playing Go, not checkers. But Bill, you obviously wrote that book for Marines to help them contextualize. So what ought a Marine do in this, competition where we may have over militarized it in some fashion?
Well, I think the first thing is, the focus on free society and our values. That definitely was something we tried to emphasize, because, with a changing administration every 4 years, those things can shift around, but our enduring national interests have remained remarkably stable for centuries. Freedom of navigation is a great example of that, because I think now going back 9 administrations to the Carter administration, formally they've directed both the Department of State and DOD to protect that on the international stage. So that, and really freedom of navigation goes back to the founding of our nation. So making sure that all service members, the whole joint force, understands the wellspring where those things come from. Those provide a competitive advantage over time, and particularly in the information space, right? When we're talking about competition below the threshold of violence, how Marines and, service members writ large, how they conduct themselves, again, those things are competitive acts. In the Marine experience, the microcosm is Okinawa, and how that relationship with those people has ebbed and flowed over the years. That constrains or allows us to do different things when we look outward. So those are some of the things. And I think the recognition, the typical Marine probably can't do a whole lot about the over militarization, but that discussion is taking place. The Commandant General Berger and General Brown, the Chief of Staff of the Air Force, recently, just a couple of weeks ago, wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post talking about what readiness really means, and trying to resource that, and just availability, meaning that it's ready today, is probably not in our best interest long term. We just can't afford it, particularly if we're going to modernize for the future, right? So I talked about that co-evolutionary nature of that kind of thing. And so I think that's part of the larger discussion, and that's an important parallel, because we're talking about a resource. We can't bankrupt ourselves as we do things like recover from COVID, rebuild the economy, et cetera. So those are a couple of things I'd offer.
Yeah, and I'm going to open it up for the other panelists as well. But one of those things that you highlight is, wouldn't it be great if we were actually competing in the humanitarian assistance disaster response area, both trying to produce advantage by delivering better results for our partners and allies overseas? And oh darn, if they actually do better than us in creating a better life for the people, that's where perhaps there's a great opportunity to have competition that results in something positive. Leo, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I'm going to reflect a lot of things that our students say, in our classroom, which is they're very cognizant as military officers of a lot of aspects of foreign policy do seem to be overly militarized. And one of the reasons is because the military has all the resources. And what is difficult sometimes is there may be a situation in a country, and the appropriate response to it would require some resources, some access and placement, some access to authorities, et cetera, et cetera. And there's a lack of synchronization, amongst the interagency players to create an appropriate response to that. And the easy button seems to be often, maybe too often, it's going to have a military face, because the military has this disproportionate amount of resourcing and a lack of coordination with interagency partners, upstream, to make a more balanced response. So I'm sort of channeling my students there.
Thanks. And Ryan, the fact that you've got a publication called War on the Rocks, obviously goes toward the military aspects, but even in your, the writings that you publish, very often it's the soft power that is in the lead. How do you see that showing up for your readers?
I'm going to answer a different question, if that's all right, or just make a completely different point, which I think is more interesting. We talk about free societies and our advantages, and I think it's also interesting, just through our little lens, how different free societies can be in between each other. So in our system, in the American system, it's completely acceptable and even encouraged increasingly for military officers active duty to write articles that are actually somewhat provocative, that disagree with guidance or propose new ways of doing things, and in public. I don't think that we understand how, in Western circles, how unique this is. You can't do that if you're a British Army or military officer. You cannot do that if you are a French military officer. You can if you're Australian. But most European countries, certainly our biggest allies in Europe, do not have that sort of free and open culture of discussion, which I think is a liability, and just an interesting one. And I'll leave my remarks on this question to that.
Outstanding. And, one of the questions in the chat, Ernest Jadlock asked, if this is great power competition, when can we say a competitor has achieved victory? When can we say a competitor has lost? In some ways, Bill, I got the sense from your remarks that we're really in an infinite game, and that it's not about the winning or losing, but continuing to play the game. Certainly, Corey, until they're no longer a relevant adversary. But how do you, as you look at it, what does winning look like in this competition? And I'll start with you, Bill.
Yeah, there's never a finish line, right? So you continue to compete, and it's always going on. So you're either in the act of winning or in the act of losing. And so there's a wonderful little book called The Logic of Failure, which looks at human systems and how they unfold, and people who do the best at some of the simulations they made little adjustments over time, but they made frequent adjustments all the time, and they did better. And I think that's more of the dynamic that we're seeing here.
So Bill's just given my favorite description of strategy, which is small adjustments as circumstances change, that add up. I mean, I'm a St. Louis Cardinals fan, so brilliance at the fundamentals actually, and small incremental change really adds up over a 162 game season. I would give a different answer than Bill on what constitutes winning and losing, though, because in the specific case of the international order that the United States and its allies have created, and that China and to some extent Russia, to some extent Iran, to some extent North Korea are attempting to change, the definition of success will be when they consent to abide by the rules of the existing order. That is, to compete on the terms of the existing order rather than seeking to upend those rules. And we can stop worrying and carefully paying attention to where we need to make small adjustments once that happens, but we're nowhere near that.
Can I jump in there, Todd?
Please do, absolutely.
I think one of the problems, and I was thinking about this more recently because we published a great article on how the Spanish-American War came about by a great scholar out of Harvard named Arup Mukherjee, and I know Arup, and I apologize for butchering his last name in advance. But one of the things that he emphasizes in that point is, history should be told forwards and not backwards. And I think we know our history very well backwards, but we don't know it forwards. And that leads us into sort of distorted views about how great power competition could play out and who wins and who loses. I think we're expecting either a wartime scenario where Hitler kills himself in the bunker and the German army surrenders, or we drop nuclear weapons on Japan. Or we're hoping for the fall of the Berlin Wall moment, where it's like a clear delineation that this is over. But even at the time, people didn't think that that meant it was necessarily over in both cases, actually, in all cases. And, it certainly could have gone another way. I mean, just a few years later in Russia, the events of the attempted coup, things could have turned out quite differently. So I think we're waiting for our historical analogies, or at least our reading of those historical analogies, to be prophecy. When in fact, I think we should be looking a lot more towards the 18th and 19th century and look at great power competition in those eras. I think that might have more to teach us.
Yeah, that actually tees it up well for Leo, because many of the students that are in his classes have really been raised on the last decade or two of what really wasn't considered to be great power competition. It was, very much a counterinsurgency, low intensity conflict. How do you help them make the transition between what was and what will be in the future?
Is that me, Todd?
Yeah,
guys. Yeah, the soft community for sure. This is every student right now coming through our program is wrestling with this conceptual transition from the CT coin fight to the role of soft in great power competition. And I think one thing that the CT coin fight in many ways sort of obscured about the special operations community is its number one superpower is relationship building. And in the movies and in popular culture, it's been reduced to sort of direct action and raids and commando stuff. But really, these men and women have this, selection, training, profound experience at relationship building. I think the task for the military in general and the special operations leadership in particular is to begin to come up with specific activities that allow these soft professionals to apply this relationship building superpower in great power competition. So I think activities like security force assistance, partner capacity building, I think this is really going to be an area where they can contribute to these nations' defenses on their own security terms, but also build these enduring relationships, which I think to get to Corey's point and other people that, this is this attractiveness of the institutions of the United States. They're really the tip of the spear on that, just as much, if not more so, on the direct action stuff for which all the movies are made.
Can I roll in support of that and take it beyond the soft community to say the exact same thing is true of the CIA? That mostly what the CIA did during the Cold War is keep opposition newspapers in print, smuggling Solzhenitsyn and Pasternak's novels out of the Soviet Union, not trigger pulling or the kinds of things that we think of so much in the military intelligence fusion of the last 20 years.
Yeah, Corey, I think that's a fantastic point. I was actually going to say that as a Middle East Foreign Area Officer, it would be remiss of me not to say that the Foreign Area Officer community sees itself playing an enormous role in developing the relationships. And in each one of those country teams, in an embassy or in a command overseas, letting State Department lead, letting them have their part, and then filling in the gaps where appropriate with specific capabilities that they may not have. And I would also be interested, and we can talk about this in a little bit. We dismantled the U.S. Information Service, and gave away a capability. So in some ways, we abdicated a battle space to the adversary. So we could think about that. I do want to get to one question from our chat, just because I do think the role of technology is a key player in this. Joshua Harrington asks, thank you for your participation. With the expansion of Huawei and 5G becoming inevitable, what is the next step for the US in competing and mitigating China's influence? What does a holistic approach look like? Who wants to start with that?
I'll take a swing at that. Accelerate past 5G to 6 or 7 so that they become the dinosaur technology and we move on past it, would be one thing. Second, we need to think carefully about the ways, what are the engines of our technological innovation? And how do we shield them from intellectual property theft without looking like we don't want the world's best talent to come and participate in the United States? That, all of us can hate Silicon Valley, and most of us do. And yet, all of us would be sitting in the dark in our houses, unable to have this conversation without them. And so finding ways to shield what we need to shield and partner where we can partner. I'm a huge fan of finding ways, for example, on, one of the elements of strategy is turning fixed constraints into variables. And so right now, rare earths are fixed constraints on the United States, but China's not the only country that has them. They're not even the major country that had them. And we made a choice to let them do the processing of them because it's dirty and environmentally unpleasant. But if you got a consortium of Japan, Australia, and the United States, you could run the market on the Chinese with a little industrial policy. And so we need to limber ourselves up for the non-military parts of our competition.
No, that's fantastic. Bill?
Well, I think one thing that would also help is we need to find the next George Kennan, which, he wasn't perfect and he didn't do everything, but we need to celebrate somebody outside of the Department of Defense who's thinking about great power competition and is framing the discussion in a productive way. So I don't know if that's in the commercial sector today or if it could be from somebody in government, but celebrating somebody like that who has a plan would be very helpful to move the discussion away from the militarized piece of it.
So I both agree with that, but am levitating out of my chair to point out that Kennan didn't have a plan. NHTSA had a plan, and it was NSC 68. Kennan was a terrible strategist. He would have he would have demobilized the American military in Europe in a way that would have ceded France, Germany, the Low Countries to Soviet control. So I don't want George Kennan. I'd rather have Paul Nitze.
There you go, Paul and Nitze. Ryan?
Get them both.
Exactly.
Excellent point.
Yeah, I'll just say, just to finish Corey's point, I think there should be a new rule about no more X articles and no more Y articles. People should just sign their names to things. But I will, on this, I really would focus to answer this question on immigration. And I think there's a lot of bipartisan support for something that, and I'm going to put the article in the chat that I'm talking about, but Dave McCormick, a friend of mine, who's the CEO of Bridgewater, the hedge fund, just wrote a great piece in Fortune about how immigration reform can really help us in this regard. And this is, I think he sketches out a plan that both Democrats and Republicans, even in this era, could get behind. And I think that's, everything starts with having the right people. And we've succeeded for generations by attracting a lot of those people who might have been outcasts or underprivileged in their own country, but achieved a lot here and totally revolutionized the way we do things. And they still are. And I think that's very important.
Fantastic. Leo?
Just to follow on from Corey's point as well, she used the word industrial policy, which I think is really important. Love or hate Donald Trump, when he came into office and simply used the term economic nationalism, whether you agree with it or not, just uttering those words opened the space for us to consider creating strategies that synchronize both, the economic, the military, foreign policy together. I think the iron is hot for the United States to rethink the relationship between the public and private sector in some more fundamental ways than it has in a long time, since the end of the Cold War, really. Number one, if there's any rich people out there, I would recommend that you endow some chairs of economics who study defense economics. It's a dead economic subfield. It has really been for decades. And we need to understand the shape of defense industry, the relationship between national security and Silicon Valley. OTAs are cool. They're not going to solve the fundamental problem. We need a deeper plan. And so I think the iron is hot right now for us to think of some of these activities, industrial policy, that would be linked to actual national strategy and purpose.
Yeah, thanks, Leo. And I just want to highlight that one of those things that Corey, you mentioned, the acceleration of innovation is not just the acceleration of the innovation inside the Defense Department. It's the acceleration of innovation across the entire scope of our economic and, the diplomatic informational power as well. And I don't think there's been as much thought about how might we innovate on some of those other sectors. I think the information innovation is happening already. And that actually gets to another question that one of our observers or attendees is asking. And Luke Stockman is asking about what's the impact of this focus on China on our Atlantic alliances, the commitment of forces of material to Europe? Do we need to better frame it in order to emphasize the importance of the Atlantic Alliance? And I want to broaden this out just a little bit and say, how important are our allies and partners in shaping the global competitive space and engaging with them? And again, we talked a little bit about this, but this time I want to start with Leo. Can you start us off with that, thinking about the role of allies and partners in this competitive space?
I think it's incredibly important. If you, the biggest naysayers, or I should say the most pessimistic observers of U.S. The capacity for the United States to project these large, expensive platforms around the world to project American power. Most pessimistic people think that those will be shredded by A2AD capabilities pretty quickly. So if that's not the way that the United States is going to be able to not control, but shape outcomes around the world, it's going to be through relationships with allies and partners. Once again, with the changing of administration, I think the iron's hot to really put some new energy into really thinking about the types of relationships we build, how we conceive of our alliances. And I think obviously NATO is the the big elephant in the room in that discussion. And I'll pass it to some of the other speakers here because I'm sure they know more about NATO than I do.
Outstanding.
I'll take a swing at that one. I agree with everything Leo just said about the importance of allies. The US is 23% of the world economy. If you add our European and North American partners in, that takes you to about 50% of global economy. If you add in America's allies in Asia, you're up to about 75% of global GDP, right? Like, as a regulatory power, as somebody who determines what shape electrical plugs get, as somebody who can determine what social media companies can and cannot do with our data, Europe's hugely consequential. Moreover, if we can't convince the Europeans, you can't convince anybody to come along with you, because the values issue really, really matters. I will place a wager with anyone on this call that 5 years from now, Volkswagen will not have that plant in Xinjiang in China that they put right outside the gates of the Uyghur internment camps. And not because the US is spitting mad about it, because when Germans start to pay enough attention, and you can already see the tornado beginning to spin up of, we said never again about the Holocaust, and boycott Volkswagen is already starting up. So the European conversation on China lags the United States by several years because we're a Pacific power and most of our NATO allies are not Pacific powers. So they're just beginning to get a taste of having their intellectual property stolen. And with Germany in particular, the Mittelstand companies, the manufacturing companies that are the bulwark of Germany's economy, China is just getting to the point where their manufacturing's sophisticated enough to compete head on with German car makers. And that's gonna create converts towards a hawkish view of China very fast. So we shouldn't think just because we are struggling to make the argument at the moment that we're gonna lose the argument. We're actually gonna win this argument.
I'm less worried about Europe mobilizing in the right direction on China, but I'm more worried about our European allies, what they're doing in Europe. I mean, first I'll say, I think the forthcoming strategic review that the UK is coming out with is incredibly important for us to watch. And from what we hear is going to be in it, from moves that we've seen the UK making elsewhere, I'm very encouraged that, people were talking, is France a better ally than the UK these days? I think that's sort of a silly question. The UK is still our most important ally, certainly in Europe, perhaps in the world. And they're, I think Brexit has sort of pushed them closer to us by necessity, and they're making a lot of the right strategic choices and investments, increasing their defense budget. But I worry mostly about Europe being able to handle its own backyard. Politically, Germany's willingness to stand up to Russia, even after the Navalny situation, whether it's Nord Stream 2 or other issues. And France is sort of doing its, Macron wants strategic autonomy, which I view as a sort of continuation of, de Gaullism in some ways, where, they can't really pay for their aspirations, but they're going to try anyway. And they've tried to get Germany to pay for them, but Germany won't. And so I'm a lot less worried about what we can expect from Europe in Asia. I really want to expect more from Europe in Europe. And while I'm encouraged by Biden's re-engagement and celebration of NATO, which is our most important alliance, I wonder if he's going to be able to nudge them in the right direction, which is really a political problem, not a sort of military capacity capability problem.
Bill?
Yeah, I think just quickly, the allies and partners, having them is just a huge competitive advantage, particularly when, China and Russia, but it's one of the things that China fears, or at least actively dislikes, our alliance and partner structure. So, we're onto something. Put it in baseball terms, China just wants fastballs, and they see the alliance and partners as curveballs all day long. So that's what we should be looking to throw to them.
Thank you, Bill. Appreciate that. I'm going to end with, we have one last question, and I appreciate the panel if we could stay on for a couple of minutes past 4. And this actually comes from Ryan Gosson. When we talk about great power competition and specifically China, what are your thoughts that our economies might be too intertwined so that neither can have the other one fall? Is it just a game of cat and mouse with each one trying to gain a little leg up, but no one really wins? How do you see that in the great power competition, or the competition, I should say, with China?
So our goal shouldn't be the destruction of the Chinese economy. That would be terrible for Americans. The price of all sorts of things that have been so cheap in the last 30 years would skyrocket. And you would have Chinese people descending again into deep poverty. And that's not good for the world the United States wants to create. What we want, what we need, is a China that consistently plays by the rules, that doesn't hack Google down to its core technologies, that is transparent about the terms of investment deals for the Hambantota port in Sri Lanka, a China whose currency evaluations are transparent so that it can open its market for investment in a more significant way. All we need is a rule-abiding China, and it's in China's interest, but the Chinese government doesn't believe that at the moment. Because of our behavior, they believe they can partially comply with the rules, cheat on the rest, and everybody's going to give them a pass. And we just got to stop doing that. We don't have to destroy the Chinese economy. We don't have to pull every supply chain apart. In fact, if we just created supply chain redundancy, that would create the leverage that the Chinese would begin to be more rule-abiding, because we would have alternatives.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Bill?
I think in some ways we've just gotten lazy. I think the answer to the question is yes, we're intertwined. And I don't think China, I mean, they want to achieve their objectives without violence. You know, they don't want a war. And they're trying to do that in some very imaginative ways. You know, we've been in the joint force, certainly the past 20 years, but back to World War II, I mean, we've been swimming in a sea of air supremacy for so long, we forgot what it's like to act differently. And so we need to roll up our sleeves and get to work. I mean, we're competing with these people. It is intertwined, but there's nothing that says that we have to go to war with them. I mean, we can compete very effectively and advance our interests as long as we apply some of the innovative thought that all the panelists have talked about.
Outstanding. Leo, any thoughts on that?
Just to follow on from these comments, you know, we always talk about when there's really two great powers that have the potential for a catastrophic war, which no one wants. We talk about this stability-instability paradox, and that, you know, you can't have this big conflagration at the top. So you do all these things at lower levels. I think it's really an advantage that our economy is intertwined with China, because it gives us a lot of levers to shape Chinese behavior. I think Corey's spot on. We would never want to collapse the Chinese economy. That would be a catastrophe for the globe. Instead, it gives us many, many levers to begin to shape outcomes that are mutually beneficial, acceptable to us, without having to fire a shot. So just agreeing with the other panelists.
No, fantastic. Last thoughts, Ryan? Yeah, I would say, you know, one of the things that it really comes back to me is, what kind of world do we want our children to live in? And then how do we shape our actions to create that future world, to bring it into being? The other thing that came out of this conversation is, it seems like from this conversation, we're changing what our investments ought to make. That if we've over-militarized our strategy, then perhaps we should be looking at some of those investments as, you know, I think Leo talked about national infrastructure, investments in enhancing our human talent so that we can compete at all levels of the competition and not just on the military aspects of it. Panelists, I just want to thank you so much for a really fantastic conversation. We at the Naval Postgraduate School Alumni Association and Foundation, we host these events roughly once every 4 to 6 weeks. And it's about bringing a conversation together that perhaps is not being held in other places around, certainly not on this side of the United States, but bringing some of those best thoughts from you guys that are on the East Coast. Thank you so much for participating, and we look forward to seeing you at our next event.